You broke it open, not gently, not carefully, not the way people plan their exits or rehearse their truths in the mirror. You cracked the whole thing apart, and before the dust could even settle, before you could catch your breath or cover your face or explain yourself, millions of people were already watching, already running, already gone, and you stood there, alone, in the wreckage of something you had built with your own hands, your own sleepless nights, your own silence and sacrifice. You stood there and the world looked at you like you were the catastrophe, like you were the thing that went wrong. Let them think that, because what they saw was not the whole truth. What they saw was the moment the pressure finally exceeded the container. What they saw was the explosion, but they never saw the years of compression. They never saw what was being held inside. They never sat with you at 3 in the morning when the weight of it all pressed down on your chest and you still got up, still showed up, still moved. They saw the crack. They never saw the load that caused it. And so they ran. Millions of them. Fingers pointing, voices loud. The kind of noise that sounds like judgment but is really just fear dressed up in borrowed confidence. People who had never built anything, tearing apart something they could not understand. People who had never been to the edge, criticizing how you looked when you stood at it. You broke the system wide open, and they ran because of you. Let that sentence sit there for a second. Let it breathe, because there is something in that sentence that most people miss entirely. They ran because of you, not in spite of you, because of you. That means you were the force. You were the variable that changed the equation. You were the thing that could not be ignored, could not be managed, could not be quietly filed away into the category of things that do not matter. You mattered so much that your fracture caused a tremor. You moved so significantly that your stumble made millions react. Weak things do not shake systems. Ordinary things do not scatter crowds. You do not run from something that poses no threat to the lies you have organized your life around. They ran because somewhere in what you did, in what you exposed, in what you cracked open, there was a truth they were not ready to face about the world, about themselves, about the fragile architecture of appearances they have all agreed to protect. And you, without even meaning to, broke the agreement. No, no, no. This is not a celebration of recklessness. This is not permission to stay in the wreckage and call it art. This is something far more serious than that. This is the beginning of a conversation about what happens after the system breaks, after the crowd runs, after the noise dies down and you are left with just yourself and the echo of everything that just happened. Because that moment, that silence after the chaos, that is where your real story begins. Not the version the crowd narrates, not the version that trends for a week and then gets recycled into someone else's cautionary tale. Your real story, the one no one gets to watch unless you choose to show it. The one being written right now, in the quiet, in the pain, in the long, slow work of becoming. Let me ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, not for me, but for yourself. When everything fell apart, when the crowd scattered and the noise became unbearable, who were you? Not who were you performing to be. Not who were you trying to convince them you still were. Who were you? Actually, underneath all of it, when there was nothing left to protect and no audience left to impress, because that person, that stripped down, unguarded, cornered version of you, that is the most important human being you will ever meet. That is the raw material. That is what every great transformation in the history of the world has started from. Not from strength, not from comfort, not from applause. From that moment, that exact, devastating, clarifying moment when everything you thought you were gets peeled away and you are left with just the core. Most people cannot survive that moment. Not because they lack talent, not because they lack intelligence, but because they have never been forced to answer that question with brutal honesty. They have always had the crowd, the role, the performance, the identity costume to fall back on. And when those things remain intact, you never truly know yourself. You had yours stripped away, in front of everyone, on the loudest stage the modern world offers, and you survived it. Do you understand what that means? It means you have already done the thing most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You have already been to the bottom of the truth about yourself, and you came back. You looked at the worst possible version of the moment, and you did not disappear. You are still here, still breathing, still reading, still, somewhere beneath the weight of it all, still reaching. That is not weakness. That is the rarest form of strength there is. The wound is real. I am not going to stand here and minimize it. I am not going to wrap it in sentiment and call it beautiful. It hurt. The betrayal of being seen at your worst, of having your fracture become someone else's entertainment, of watching people you thought were with you suddenly become experts on your failure. That pain is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged before anything else. Because here is what happens when people skip the acknowledgement. When they rush past the wound toward the motivational speech, the wound does not heal. It just goes underground. It becomes the thing that shows up 3 years later, when you are about to break through and you self-sabotage without understanding why. It becomes the invisible weight that keeps pulling you back to the floor every time you almost reach the ceiling. So let the wound be what it is. You were seen at your worst, and it was public. And millions of people decided what that meant about you before you even had a chance to decide for yourself. They wrote your verdict with borrowed ink on borrowed authority. And they were so certain, so loud, so absolute in their conclusions about a moment they witnessed from the outside of your entire life's context. That is its own kind of violence, a quiet one. The kind that does not leave marks visible enough to be taken seriously, but hollows you out from the inside just the same. And if you spent any time in that hollow space, hating yourself, questioning everything, replaying the moment on a loop as if watching it enough times would somehow rewrite it, then you already know exactly what I am talking about. That loop, that inescapable, relentless loop of the thing you cannot undo being played on the loudest screen inside your own mind. Every second in that loop is a second you are not building. Every hour inside that replay is an hour the version of you that survives this is waiting at the door, unable to come in because you are still at the window watching the crowd. Let me tell you what I know about people who break systems. Not from theory, from the pattern that repeats itself across every generation, across every field, across every story worth actually telling. They almost never planned to. The system breaker rarely woke up and said, "Today I will expose everything. Today I will shake the foundations. Today I will make millions run." It happened because they lived too honestly, or reached too far, or refused too firmly, or fell too visibly. It happened because they were not willing to keep compressing. And when it broke, the system did what systems always do. It named them the problem. Because systems are not interested in truth. Systems are interested in stability. And the person who tells the truth that disrupts the stability is always going to be named the destabilizer, not the lie that required the disruption, not the condition that made the explosion inevitable. You, the person who broke the silence, the person who stopped performing the agreement. Look at what they did with that. They used your worst moment to write your entire story. They took the loudest, most visible fraction of your life and declared it the defining chapter. They held it up like evidence in a case they had already decided. And the verdict was delivered before the trial even started. But here is something they cannot take from you, something they do not have access to, no matter how loud they get, no matter how many of them run in the same direction. They cannot take what you know now. And what you know now is something extraordinary. You know what you are made of when everything is taken away. You know the difference between who you were performing and who you actually are. You know the weight of being truly seen at your worst and surviving it. You know that public opinion is not the same thing as truth. You know that crowds are not the same thing as judges. You know that disapproval is not the same thing as proof. You know things now that took everything to learn. And that knowledge is not a consolation prize. That knowledge is currency. That knowledge is architecture. That is what your next chapter is built on. Because here is the shift. Here is the turn in the story that most people never let themselves reach because they stay in the wound too long or run from it too fast. There is a moment, and it is different for everyone, when the humiliation stops being something that happened to you and starts being something that happened for you. Now, I know how that sounds. I know how every person who has ever been in your position heard that sentence and wanted to throw something. Because from inside the pain, from inside the hollow, from inside the replay loop, that sentence sounds like the worst kind of dismissal. Like someone standing at a safe distance telling you that your suffering was actually a gift. That is not what I am saying. What I am saying is this. The pain was real. The loss was real. The humiliation was real. And at the exact same time, simultaneously, running in parallel to all of that, something else was happening. A transformation was being forced on you that could not have been achieved any other way. A truth about yourself was being excavated that comfort would have buried forever. A version of you was being born that the old version, the one who still needed the crowd's approval, the one who still needed the performance to feel real, that version could never have given birth to. Both things are true. The wound and the gift, the loss and the gain, the breaking and the becoming. They are not opposites. They are the same event seen from different distances. And the distance you need is time and discipline and silence, because here is where the real work starts. Here is where the version of you that everyone eventually marvels at begins to be constructed. Not in the applause, not in the comeback speech, not in the viral moment of redemption that the crowd will eventually demand as payment for their prior judgment. In the silence. In the long, unglamorous, invisible season of rebuilding, when no one is watching and no one is cheering, and there is no performance to sustain you. Just you and the work. And the slow accumulation of days that do not look like anything from the outside, but are laying foundations that will outlast everything. This is the part no one talks about, because it is not dramatic enough to be content. It is not painful enough to be a tragedy, and not triumphant enough yet to be a success story. It is just the middle, the unglamorous, essential, irreplaceable middle. The waking up before you feel like it. The doing the work before the motivation arrives. The building in the dark before the light comes. The trusting the process before the results are visible. The choosing. Every single day, in the quiet, without applause, without validation, without any external evidence that it is working, to become the thing you decided to become. That is where identity is forged, not in the crowd's reaction, in the daily decision when no one is watching. And self-discipline is the language of that decision. Not the dramatic, cinematic 5 a.m. cold shower version that gets packaged and sold to people who want the aesthetic without the transformation. The real version, the boring version. The version where self-discipline is simply the practice of honoring your future self more than you honor your present discomfort. Every time you do the thing you said you would do, even when you do not feel like doing it, you are making a deposit. Every time you choose the long game over the immediate relief, every time you sit in the discomfort instead of running from it, every time you hold the standard you set for yourself, even when no one would notice if you let it slide, you are building something. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare. And that thing you are building is the most powerful version of you that has ever existed. Think about what that means for someone who has already been through what you have been through. Because you are not starting from zero. You are not some untested person hoping they can handle pressure. You have already handled pressure. You have already been through the thing most people cannot even imagine surviving. You have already looked at the worst version of the moment and come back from it. That means every day you spend in disciplined, intentional rebuilding is not just adding. It is compounding on a base that is already stronger than most people ever develop. You are not rebuilding the old you. That is critical to understand. The old you was the one who broke. Not because you were weak, but because something in the old construction was not built to hold what you were actually carrying. The system cracked because the design did not match the load. And that is not a failure of the person. That is information about what needs to change in the architecture. So you do not rebuild the same structure and hope it holds this time. You redesign. You look at what cracked and you understand why. You ask the hard questions, not the self-punishing ones, not the ones that spiral into shame and conclusion. The engineering questions. What was under too much pressure? What was being held together by performance instead of by foundation? What was built for the crowd instead of built for the truth? And then you build differently. You build for endurance, not for appearance. You build for truth, not for approval. You build for the version of you that exists when no one is watching, not the version that performs for the ones who are. And here is something remarkable that happens when you start building that way. The people who ran, who scattered when the system broke, who pointed and narrated and delivered their verdicts, they become irrelevant. Not because you stopped caring, not because you became cold or detached or untouchable, but because your North Star changed. When your North Star was their approval, their absence was devastating. When your North Star is your own integrity, their absence is just quiet. And quiet is where the best work happens. This is the part of the story that silence plays a role in that people profoundly underestimate. Not the silence of someone who has given up, not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. The silence of someone who has decided that their energy belongs to the building and not to the responding. Because every time you engage with the verdict they wrote about you, every time you try to explain yourself to people who were not asking a genuine question, every time you perform your recovery for the crowd that witnessed your fracture, you are dividing energy that belongs to the construction. The most powerful response to what happened to you is not a statement. It is not a comeback post. It is not a viral moment of redemption. It is what you become over time. It is the version of you 5 years from now that has been quietly, relentlessly, unapologetically built in the silence of the season everyone else wrote off. That is your response. And it does not need words, and it does not need their applause, and it does not need their revision of the verdict they already delivered. Because by the time that version of you is fully visible, the verdict will be self-evidently irrelevant. Not because you proved them wrong, because you became someone that the version of them who judged you could not have even comprehended. You become incomprehensible to the version of them that wrote you off. And that is not revenge, that is elevation. And those are two very different things. Revenge is about them, elevation is about you. And this is where the higher standard enters. Not the standard of the crowd, not the standard of the critics, not the standard of the industry or the trend or the public opinion of the moment. The standard that lives in the part of you that knows the difference between who you have been and who you are capable of becoming. There is something inside every human being, something that does not negotiate, does not rationalize, does not compromise with comfort, that knows, it knows when you are giving everything. It knows when you are cutting corners. It knows when you are building something real versus maintaining something fake. It knows the difference between the version of you that will make you proud at the end of your life and the version of you that will make you regret. That inner knowing is the highest authority you will ever answer to, higher than public opinion, higher than the crowd's verdict, higher than the metrics and the numbers and the approval ratings and all the external evidence of whether you are succeeding or failing. It is the part of you that is accountable not to what the world thinks of you, but to what you know you are capable of. And it cannot be lied to. You can lie to the crowd. You can construct a performance for the masses. But that inner knowing sits in silence, unimpressed by the performance, waiting for the truth. Live in alignment with it, and you will know a kind of peace that no applause can give you. Betray it, and you will know a kind of unrest that no success can quiet. And everything you have been through, All of it. The breaking, the exposure, the running of millions, the silence, the rebuilding, all of it has been bringing you into closer proximity with that standard, whether you chose it consciously or not. Whether it felt like growth or felt like destruction, the process has been the same. The compression has been building toward a clarity that only this kind of fire can produce. Because you do not get refined at comfortable temperatures. You do not discover what you are made of in the easy seasons. The character that carries you through the rest of your life. The identity that no public event can shake. The foundation that holds when the next pressure comes. And it will come. Because that is how life works for people who are building something real.